Welcome everyone here today to the inaugural Desautels Research Lecture. We're delighted to have Professor Bellamy as our first speaker. He is an associate professor of history at Carleton University and specializes in Canadian business, political and cultural history. He is the author of Profiting the Crown, Canada's Polymer Corporation, 1942 to 1990, for which he received the 2006 National Business Book Award. His latest research has taken him into the realm of brewing history, and his book, Brewed in the North, A History of Labatts, was published by McGill Queen's University Press, and that's what he'll speak to us about today. And Professor Bellamy contends that no history is more revealing about culture, history, and attitudes than Brewed in the North. Give us a warm virtual welcome to Professor Bellamy. And he's agreed to reserve a little time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, I'll be moderating those. You can feel free to put them in the chat. You can either type out the question, or if you'd prefer to speak your question out, just type the word question, and then I'll know to call on you when that time comes. And I'll also just give you the link here to Professor Bellamy's book if anyone would like to check it out. It sounds like an utterly fascinating read. And without further ado, I will turn the floor over to the good professor and let him guide us through a very interesting history in Labatt's Brewing Company.
Well, thank you, Virginia. That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you to everybody for coming today. What I'd like to do this afternoon over the lunch hour or the next 45 minutes or so is to tell you a bit about Labatt. And you guys probably remember the name Labatt. As we'll hear today, they were founded in 1847 and they exist as an autonomous agent on the free market until 1995. And at that point, they're bought out by Interbrew. And today they're part of the group of corporations that are owned by AB InBev, who's the largest brewery in the world. But you might remember in the 1980s and 1990s when Labatt along with Molson were omnipresent. It was a world before we live in now, where the kind of Canadian beer marketplace is dominated by global players on the one hand and craft brewers on the other. But back in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, Labatt, along with Molson, produced 95% of all the beer sold in Canada. And you would walk into any bar and it'd either be the Molson bar or a Labatt bar, you probably remember. The history of this corporation goes all the way back to 1847. And what I'd like to do today is to focus on the first part of their history when they're family owned and controlled, because this institute is concerned about family ownership. But then I'd like to transition to when they become a managed enterprise. And this is kind of interesting for those that are interested in the law, because this is a period during which we see prohibition in this country. And we're going to see laws that come into place at the provincial level that restrict the retail sale of intoxicating beverages. And this is going to have a profound effect on the brewing industry across the nation. We're going to see about half the breweries in the country go bankrupt, and many that do survive limp towards the Great Depression and were wiped out by that. And then we see a brewing oligopoly emerge after the Second World War. And Labatt is dominant in all this. What's really interesting to me as a historian of the beer industry is the fact that, some breweries exist or manage to survive prohibition and come out actually stronger from this experience. And this is the case of Labatt, because they handed over, as we're going to hear, to a hard-nosed Irishman by the name of Edmund Burke, who is their general manager, who turns them into one of the best bootleggers in Canadian history, along with the Brofman family, of course. So that's what I'd like to talk about at the back end, last 20 minutes or so, before we get to Burke and his kind of amoral ways. I'd like to talk about family ownership and look at John Kinder Labatt, who's the founder of this company. And if we, raise our altitude to 30,000 feet, we're going to see a guy that kind of challenges the stereotypical images of the successful entrepreneur. If you think of the Cher Wangs or the Sarah Berkeleys or the Henry Fords or the Steve Jobs or the Timothy Edens, they're all kind of determined, visionary, confident people. At least that's the perspective that we're given. But with the case with John Kinder Labatt, as we're going to hear, he's full of doubts. So he's the doubtful entrepreneur. And then we'll see it handed off to his son in 1866. And then I'll fast track over to the third generation, where we see a Buddenbrooks effect coming into effect at Labatts. And that's that notion that the third generation in family businesses don't have the dynamism that either the founding father does or his or her successor. So that's where I'd like to go with all of this today, and then allowing about 10 minutes at the back end to take any questions if you have any, if that's okay with you. So let me begin, if that's okay, with June 17th, 1921. And on that day, there's a hastily arranged board of directors meeting that takes place at the house of Hume Croyne in London, Ontario. And all the members of the Labatt board gather there that day, and they're all family members. They've either married into the Labatt family or they're Labatts themselves. And they resolve, and you can read this in the minutes, they resolve, and I'm quoting, "Unless something very unforeseen occurs, we're going to close down the brewery a year hence. Prohibition has taken its toll on this corporation, and they're done. They're out of money. They have no vision on how to survive. They're finished. So they're going to close it down." At that meeting, however, there's one outsider, a guy by the name of Edmund Burke, this hard-nosed Irishman who had cut his teeth selling tobacco and whiskey south of the border in the United States, had joined Labatt in the early 1900s and had climbed the rungs of the corporate ladder to become the general manager of Labatt. And having heard that resolution, he steps in and he says to the family members, whoa, 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 whoa. Let me make you an offer. Let me run things. Give me 10% of the profits. Don't ask any questions. And I guarantee not only will you survive, but you will thrive during Prohibition. And as we're going to hear in about 20 minutes, he takes over, and I'll tell you how he saves this firm from Prohibition and bankruptcy. So I'll get back to him in just a second, but let me backtrack now and go quickly through the history of Labatt, touching on those key things. I don't want to get too mired in Labatt history. Obviously, we'll tell it, but I want to keep bringing our altitude back up to see the big landscape as it relates to Canadian history and business history, if that's okay with you. The founding father himself, born in 1803 in Mount Melnick, Ireland. If you know Mount Melnick, it's about an hour and a half by car from Dublin to the southwest, and for much of its history, it was a small rural territory. But then it gets caught up, like so many towns did in the Industrial Revolution, and it sees itself as the Manchester of Ireland. This is the backdrop for which John Kinder Labatt grows up, and so he's seeing this technological innovation all around him. He will always be dedicated to manufacturing because of this, as we'll hear, and also he's optimistic throughout his life because he's seeing this tremendous economic growth that's taking place. Because he's from poor Huguenot stock, however, he doesn't have the money to go off to get a post-secondary education. So at the age of 27, in 1830, he shoots off to the greatest metropolis on the face of the globe, London, England. And this is Dickens, England, right? There's 1 million people there. It's smokestacks everywhere. It's dirty, it's grungy, it's dark, right? There's economic opportunity, however. And Labatt arrives there, and he immediately finds a position as a clerk at an import and exporter in Bankside. And you might know Bankside if you travel to London. That's where the Globe Theatre is now. If you cross the Millennium Bridge from St. Paul's, there's the Tate right in front of you, and then you walk left and there's the Globe. And for much of its history, Bankside was a playground for the rich. It's where the rich went to debauch. You know, they would get involved in, go to the brothels, they would go to the pubs, and they would get involved in the betting that was going on there, in the cockfighting and the bear baiting. And then they would go back across the Thames to their proper lives. But by the time Labatt gets there, all that's gone, and there's factories that are there. And around him are these huge monuments to high technology, and some of them are large breweries, and that'll always be at the back of Labatt's mind as well. Now, because he's Irish, he's the low man on the social ladder. He can't move up, despite the fact that this guy works hard. He's putting in 14-hour days. He just can't move up at the corporation or company that he's at. And as a result of this, you know, he's starting to let his mind wander. He's starting to look for opportunities elsewhere. While his professional life isn't going that well, his personal life in 1833 takes a turn for the better, in the sense that he meets a younger woman by the name of Eliza Kell, 12 years his junior, and she comes from an upper middle class family. She would have had no time, or her father, more correctly, would have had no time for John Labatt, except for the fact that John Kell, Eliza Kell's father, had worked at the Bank of England and had taken a speculative investment and lost heavily on it. And now it looked like he was going to go off to debtor's prison. And so John Labatt recognizes an opportunity, approaches Mr. Kell and says, "Can I have your daughter's hand in marriage?" And John Kell says, "Yes, but you also have to take care of my wife." And so John Labatt agrees to this. And in 1833, he gets married. The next thing he does is he decides, we're moving, we're getting out of here. And in London this time, pamphlets are circulating in London about free land on the rough and tumble upper Canadian frontier. And so over they come in 1834. They don't get struck by cholera. They arrive here safely, the two Kells and John Labatt, and they make a claim to land through the the York Property Office, giving their £50 and getting 200 acres of land to the south of London, Ontario. And for the next 15 years, John Labatt farms, and he's a great farmer. He grows barley, he grows wheat, he grows corn, and he does really well. But then in 1847, he kind of has a midlife crisis. He's thinking, you know what? I always thought of myself as better than being a farmer. At the back of his mind, he's still celebrating the manufacturers, the people that made things, right? The manufacturers in the 1850s were like the high-tech giants today, right? They were the people that were on the cutting edge of innovation. And so John Labatt wanted to be part of that class. And as a result of this, he takes the money that he had made from selling his farm and he goes back to England. He leaves his young wife and his children, 9 children behind. At this time, he will eventually have 14 kids, but he leaves them behind. And he says, "I'll call you when I find a business," and over he goes. Now, once he's there, again, to raise the altitude up to 30,000 feet, you know, again, we think of these entrepreneurs that go on to found successful businesses. And this is one of the most successful breweries that he founds in the world eventually, right? It's a global contender in the 1980s. And he's the founding father. But he's not this confident individual. He has no clue of what he wants to do. And this is captured in the letters that he's writing back to his young wife, Eliza Kell, who is back in London. And in letter after letter, he's saying things like, and I'm quoting here, "I've been too long in the backwoods to make my mark in this world." He's basically saying, I'm a dumb farmer. I can't compete with these cutthroat capitalists. You know, they're fast on their feet. They have great ideas. I can't compete. And Eliza Kell, being the loving, thoughtful wife that she is, would always write back, comforting him, right? And in one of the letters, she reports on developments that are taking place back in London, Ontario. And she says, you know, your friend, Sam Eccles, has gone into the business of brewing. Having received that letter, John Labatt looks at it and writes back quite quickly, "Oh, I should have gone into brewing. I would have been a good brewer. Darn it. You know, I always, I can remember those great breweries on Bankside." He said, "I would have been a good brewer because I know my grains. I can run them through my fingers. I can judge a good grain when I see it." He said, "Also brewing, you're partly outdoors some of the time. So this would be the profession for me." And he leaves it at that. Well, having received that letter, Eliza Kell walks down the road, knocks on Sam Eccles' door and says, "Can my husband buy into your business?" And at a time when there's limited liability or isn't limited liability, entrepreneurs were often trying to mitigate their risk by taking on partners. And so Sam Eccles says, "Yes, we'll get the brewery appraised and he can buy in for half." And off they go. So that's the birth of this brewery. If you have a Labatt beer in your hand anytime soon, look at the label and it says 1847. So that's when they date this quite rightly from starting. For the next 7 years, therefore, until 1854, they operate this brewery in partnership. But then in 1854, 2 events happen. One, Sam Eccles says, "I'm tired of this business. I'm out." There's, as we're going to hear in just a second, the temperance tide is on the rise. People are starting to condemn the brewers because the temperance urge has turned into a prohibitionist urge. I'll get into the difference of that 2 things in just a second. And feeling the pressure, Sam Eccles says, "I want it." So Labatt buys the brewery and becomes the sole proprietor in 1854. At the same time that he takes over the reins of this corporation or company, he takes over the reins of this company, the military leaves London, Ontario. And that's about 1/3 to 1/2 of his clientele. Just to raise our altitude again for just one sec, you know, if we're interested as business historians or academics in the birth of companies, there's various theories out there that try to explain why companies originate. And one of the big theses in Canada is the Staple Thesis. And you probably know the name Harold Adams Innes. Harold Adams Innes is that great economist from the University of Toronto, perhaps the giant of second generation economists. And he gives us what many consider Canada's most profound contribution to political economy, which is this Staple Thesis. And Innes had been on the campus of the University of Toronto in the late 1920s and asked that very profound question: what are the very long-run factors in the integration of the Canadian nation? And this caused him to look at things like technologies, institutions, values, and geography. Now, up until Innes, various historians that had studied the making of Canada had said, no, Canada came about because of the actions of great men, great political figures: George Etienne Cartier, Alexander Galt, George Brown, Sir John A. Macdonald, right? And they had overcome our natural divisions. But Innes comes along and says, no, we didn't come, and this is his famous phrase in The Fur Trade in Canada, which comes out in 1929, we came about not in spite of our geography, but because of it. And Innes says, first there was fish, then when there were furs, then there's timber, and then there was wheat. And in the fur trade, he's fundamentally saying that Canada is the fur trade writ large, right? We were naturally oriented along an east-west axis. That's its fundamental argument. Okay, what does this have to do with brewing, you're probably thinking? Well, people after Innes want to explain the diversification of the economy, and they talk about forward and backwards linkages to those staple trades, because the staple trades are always the engine of economic growth in their opinion, right? And so you have to relate it back to the staple trades. And so if you have a fishing based industry, you would see backwards linkages into the manufacture of boats, right? Is one example. When it comes to brewing, of course, brewing would be a forward linkage from the farming that's taking place in barley or wheat. So that's the argument. But if we look at where Canada's breweries originate, right, they're nowhere near. Well, they are close to the farms, obviously, but the principal factor that's causing them to locate where they're locating is that they're always established near military or naval establishments. Why so? Because the British are giving the Navy and the military, right, enough money to buy 5 pints of beer per day. And so if you're an entrepreneur, right, if you're an enterprising spirit, as Michael Bliss terms them, you're going to set up your brewery near those individuals, right? And they want primarily British ales, porters, and stouts. And so you have Alexander Keith setting up in Hamilton. You have Susanna Oland, who founds the Moosehead Brewery. It's initially called the Army and Navy Brewery, who is just across the harbor from Halifax. You have John Molson, who's setting up his brewery in 1787, right outside the walls of Old Montreal, where there's a military establishment. And then in London, Ontario, where Labatts is, there's a British regiment as well. Thomas Carleton also sets up a brewery there to get that money that the soldiers are being given to buy their 5 pints a day. But then in 1854, off they go, right? The Crimean War is on, and that regiment leaves London, Ontario. So Labatt has lost its principal clientele. So what does he do? Well, he's one of the first brewers to embrace the new technologies of steam, steel, and rail. Having lost his clients locally, he decides to ship his beer out to distant markets. By distant, I mean all in Ontario. So he's going to Toronto, Kingston, Ottawa, Hamilton, all these areas that are quite close and are connected by rail after 1853. And so that's how Labatt continues to grow his brewery. Let me just say that success in the Canadian brewing industry, the international brewing industry, again, to raise our elevation to about 100,000 feet this time, is determined by three things. Produce a good product, market it effectively, and secure your channels of distribution. And you probably know so many good craft brewers right now that are producing an excellent product, but they're struggling because they can't get it into the hands of consumer. Channels of distribution are king. And Labatt was wily because he set up an agency network, and he was the first to do so in Canada. He kind of steals that from the British brewers, and he employs it in Canada, where he has agents promoting his product exclusively. And for these reasons and other reasons that I won't talk about today, he's successful until his death in 1866. To ensure the continued success of his brewery after he passes away, in his last will and testament, he leaves the brewery to his wife, Eliza Kell. But in the event that she doesn't want to run it and she wants to sell it, she has to sell it to his third eldest son, not his oldest son, not his second oldest son, his third eldest son. And according to the economic historian, a guy by the name of David Landis, who's written numerous books, but one of them is called Dynasties, which is about businesses that, family businesses that last at least 3 generations. Successful family firms have founders and successors who are philoprogenitive. What does this mean? They have a lot of kids. They have a lot of kids, right? Why do you want to have a lot of kids if you're an entrepreneur and have your own family business? Because then you can pass over the duds, right? And he deems Robert and Ephraim to be duds. He's like, why are we, I can't have these guys running the business. And so he signals out John Labatt II, right? And hands it over to him because, and it's a bit of a cliche, he's his father's son. He was born to brew. He grew up around the brewery, grew up around beer drinkers, and he entered the family business after being engaged in wholesaling for a little while at the age of 19. And then his father sends him off to apprenticeship south of the border in Virginia and under George Smith. And he learns how to brew IPA. And John Labatt II is smart enough to know this is the beer of the future. This is the beer of the railway age. Why? IPA, India Pale Ale. First of all, it's lighter than porters and stouts, and that's what Labatt has been making up to now, right? To appeal to those immigrants from the British Isles. They wanted to drink beers that tasted of home, as they put it. So those are what the breweries, but he goes down south to the United States and brings back IPA. It is lighter, and so it appeals to people in the summer months. Porter's great for dreary London, but not so good for hot London, Ontario in the summers, right? And so you want something more refreshing. So IPA is that. But here's the big point. IPA, India Pale Ale, is heavily hopped. There are 3 fundamental ingredients in beer, any beer: barley, hops, and fresh water. With IPA, what you're doing is you're increasing the hop content because hops are a bittering agent, 1, and number 2, and most importantly, they're a preserving agent. They naturally preserve the beer. And so if you heavily hop it, it can go further distances. So once the railroad comes along and before refrigeration is put into those railway cars, you want something that can travel long distances. And so it needs to be naturally preserved. And so this is the perfect beer for the railway age. John Labatt II comes back, convinces his dad just before his death to start producing this, and it's a success. It's a success across the board, right? It's their #1 selling beer right up until the end of the Second World War. And so he's a really good brewer, and his dad knows it, and he leaves the brewery to him. And during his tenure, which lasts as president from 1866 to 1915, he really grows the firm primarily by producing a great product and marketing it effectively, and also securing those channels of distribution. Now, one of the ways that he markets it effectively at a time before social media and the radio and TV and all these things is to enter his beer into various competitions that are going on around the world. And one of the big competitions that he enters is the World's Fair, which is down in Philadelphia in 1876. And he puts his IPA up against the likes of Bass and Pabst and other well-known brewers. And he takes away a gold medal. And quickly, he celebrates this fact that he's won the gold medal, beating all these breweries from around the globe in various newspapers across the land. And as a result of this, the brewery continues to grow. The one side effect, however, of this that has a negative consequence in the long run is it kind of makes our John Labatt II really arrogant. He becomes a bit conceited. And so having survived through the 1970s, doing wonderfully well, despite the Scott Act coming into existence in 1878, that gave us local option prohibition, the brewers were wily enough, they could kind of like go to those wet territories, right, and smuggle their beer in bottles into dry territories. So they do fine during the Scott Act. It's really a farce. But at the back end of that, Labatt decides to leave Canada for a short while, or at least make a play internationally. And he becomes the first international brewer to do so. Why does he do this? Why does he go international? Well, in part, because he's become cocky. He thinks his beer is the best beer in the world, but also because there's a profit squeeze here in his principal market of Ontario. And there's a profit squeeze because a cartel had been formed, and as so often is the case with business cartels, they breed cheaters, right? Now, again, to raise our altitude, if you look at the late Victorian age, this is a time where we don't really have free market competition. All the businesses that are about are forming cartels and associations to do what? To fix prices. Sugar manufacturers did it, dentists did it, doctors did it, jewelers did it, bankers did it, railwaymen did it, everybody did it. And the brewers certainly do it too. In the 1890s, the Ontario Brewers Association is formed, and they agree that the price at which a hogshead, which is a large keg, will be sold will be $16. But before the ink is dry almost, people are starting to cheat, right? And Labatt calls them out, right? He says, the Toronto brewers like Eugene O'Keefe and the Dominion Brewery based in Toronto are the worst of the bunch. They're a bunch of cheaters, and he wants something done about it, but no one's fixing the system. And so he's basically tired with what's going on in Ontario. Feeling confident that his beer can take on the world, he makes this international play. And what does he do? He goes off to Chicago, the Windy City. It's 650 kilometers by rail down to Chicago, and it's connected, so there's one great thing, right? And he thinks if he can make it in Chicago, he can use Chicago as a kind of launching pad to the rest of the United States. As we well know, this is a transportation hub. It was back then, it is now. And so you could fan your beer out across the nation using the railway network. So that's his plan of attack. So he goes down there in the early 1890s because of this price squeeze at home, or profit squeeze at home. But he blows in and out of the Windy City in 4 short years. And you say, what happened? He's got this great beer. He's obviously a determined guy. What goes wrong? Well, first of all, he's taking on some cutthroat competition in the shipping brewers. These are the biggest American brewers, the Anheuser-Busch's of the world, the Pabst's of the world, the Schlitz's of the world, the Millers of the world, right? And they're given to cutthroat competition. Plus, they enjoy economies of scale. They have huge factories that are based in Midwest American cities, and they've used the railway, that's why they're called the shipping brewers, to ship their product across the nation. They go national south of the border far before our brewers go national. Our brewers only go national here after the Second World War. And we have to do so because, as we all know, there's interprovincial trade barriers, right? And so in this country, what you have is a branch plant system with the big brewers having a plant in every province across the town, across the nation. That costs a lot of money. So that only happens after the Second World War. But south of the border, the shipping brewers are omnipresent, right? And they're given to this cutthroat competition. So that's number one. The second thing is the shipping brewers often own, they have a tied house system. So they often own the places in Chicago where you could sell your beer. And so this is getting back to securing your channels of distribution. Labatt didn't do that. Another thing that sets him back is the fact that he's got to pay this tariff on his product as it comes into the United States. So that's another one. The shipping costs are obviously going to cost him. Two more. The big one that's still there is that he's, because of his small volumes, he's forced to employ perhaps not the most dynamic individuals when it comes to promoting his beer. So he hires a guy by the name of Mr. Rogers. That's the only guy that he can get to promote his beer in the Windy City. And the way that beer was sold and promoted at this time was that your agent, Mr. Rogers in this case, would go into the drinking establishment and they would spend on everybody there. So they would say, what do you want to drink? And they would treat them to whatever. If they wanted hard liquor, that's fine, or wine or beer of another company, that's fine. That's the way we'd do it because you were building up your goodwill. But Mr. Rogers treated too much and drank too much. And so this guy, was a drunkard. And Labatt actually tells him at one point, I'm quoting here, put a plug in it. I don't want anybody dying on my account. I'd rather go out of business, he says. Labatt's his right-hand man, Raymond Williams, says to him, you know what, we got to can this guy. But Labatt's is almost too loyal to a fault. He won't do it. He's paternalistic. He wants to take care of Mr. Rogers. And so because of these factors and the fact that he prices his beer above even Pabst in this marketplace because of his arrogance, believing it's better than all the beers out there. Labatt blows in and out of the Windy City in 4 years, and they have to retrench in Southwest Ontario. By the time of his death, therefore, the Labatt Brewery in 1915 is a second-tier brewer. Its sales are largely confined to that area in and around London. When he passes away, John Labatt leaves the firm to his two eldest sons. He had 9 children in total. 7 of them were girls. Catherine Labatt was by far the most capable, but this is a time that women couldn't own enterprise. And so he leaves it to his eldest 2 sons. And one of them is John Sackville Labatt. The other one is Hugh Labatt. They take over the firm. They do not have the dynamism of either their grandfather or their father, right? They had been coddled for too long. They had spent their lives, going to private schools, engaged in the leisurely lifestyle. John loved to ride his horse and play golf. He was often at the London Hunt Club doing these sorts of things. Hugh, likewise, was out sailing most of the time and doing other things. So they had been given to a leisurely lifestyle. In fact, John doesn't even like beer, if you can imagine. He's drinking whiskey whenever has a drink. He's drinking whiskey. And the only time you would apparently see him with a beer in his hand was around the brewery when visitors were there. They just don't have the dynamism of their father or their grandfather. And so we're going to see a Buddenbrooks effect take place. That's a term that's given to us by Thomas Mann, who writes a fictional novel about a family dynasty, and the 3rd generation blows the family fortune. And so we talk about going from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves to 3 generations, right? And so family firms often have a tough time surviving past 3 generations. And that's certainly the case with Labatt. So again, it's 1915. The Labatt brothers are in charge, and really it's a baptism by fire because as soon as they take over, Ontario and many other provinces are hit by Prohibition. Let me digress for a second and talk to you about Prohibition, just set the stage, and then we'll come back to Edmund Burke taking over things. But you probably are well aware that temperance had been around since the early 1800s. The first temperance societies emerged in Canada in the 1820s. But the big thing to note is that the temperance movement stood for something different than the prohibitionist movement does later on. The dividing lines around 1850, you can never get the dates exactly right, but it kind of morphs after 1850. But initially, the temperance movement is about 2 things in my mind: moral suasion, that is to say, convincing people on a personal level, face to face, me going into the bar, telling Christine to put down that pint and sign this temperance pledge, that's moral suasion. So that's one half of it. The other half is temperance, not total abstinence, temperance, right? And this is a time when people drank a lot, in part out of necessity. Water could kill you. Coffee and tea were tremendously expensive. There was no refrigeration to keep your drinks cool or from souring if it's milk. Pop drinks don't exist until the 1870s. And so for all of these reasons, people drink alcohol. Alcohol will kill off the bacteria, right, in your beverage. And so people are drinking a lot of everything. And the temperance people are saying, well, beer is better than hard liquor, so drink beer. But then after 1850, you see this movement transform itself, or in the minds of some, the civil libertarians transmogrify itself, right, into a movement that is about moral regulation, using the full power of the federal government or provincial governments to legislate liquor traffic out of existence, so moral regulation, and total abstinence. And so within this climate, after about 1850, you see beer no longer being given that favorable status as a temperance drink. Indeed, it's deemed to be one of the 3 poisons, along with hard liquor and wine. The temperance movement continually gains steam, therefore, throughout the back end of the 1800s. The temperance movement thinks it's got a real win when Wilfrid Laurier comes to power. At that time in 1896, Wilfrid Laurier takes office. He receives about 3,000 letters. If you go down to the archives on Wellington Street and pore over the documentation, after he gets elected in 1896, he receives about 3,000 letters from various temperance organizations, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Presbyterian Church, the Sons of Temperance, the Dominion Alliance for the Suppression of Liquor Traffic. All of these organizations are writing, and they're telling him, this is our hour. This is our hour. We finally have a liberal in office. After all those years of Sir John A. Macdonald from 1867 to 1874, and then from 1878 all the way up until his death, but then we had the caretaker prime ministers. Finally, we have a liberal in office. And the Liberal Party was always the party of reform and always the party of prohibition, right? And so they write to him saying, this is our hour. Well, Laurier decides to do something about it. He decides, oh, what we'll do is we'll have a national vote. And so on September 29th, 1898, there's a vote nationwide about whether or not we should go dry. And English Canada comes back and, well, all of Canada comes back and said, yes, there's a majority, go dry, right? About 90% of the voting population who cast, those people that cast ballots in PEI voted to go dry. In Nova Scotia, there's 87% of the population saying we should go dry. In Manitoba, where many of you guys are, about 80%, just over 80% say let's go dry. In Ontario, where I am, it's 57%. In BC, it's about 60%. And so overwhelming support to go dry. But in Quebec, there's about 19% support. And so Laurier, being the wily politician that he is, says, whoa, that's my political base. I can't do this. They're going to toss me out, right? And so he sweeps it under the carpet. So what does this do to the temperance movement? What does this do to the prohibitionists? They finally realize this isn't a fight for control within the corridors of power. This is a fight for the hearts and minds of Canadians, right? We got to get out and change the culture around the issue of booze. And so shortly after this national plebiscite, health readers start appearing in schools, and they're full of prohibitionist propaganda about the dangerous effects of alcohol. And they go on and on about this, but one of the most dramatic ones is telling the young reader about a heavy drinker of hard alcohol and the fact that they could internally combust. They could simply break into flames. Obviously that's going to have some effect. You know, I can remember, I was born in 67. I grew up in a middle-class household. My dad was a prof, and the fear among middle-class women who cared about their kids, was the fact that perhaps we would get involved in drugs. And in the late 1970s, when I'm about 10 years old, I can remember being pulled out of my bed and put in front of the TV. And as I wipe the sleep out of my eyes, I look beside me and there's my older sister, a year and a half older, and she's got these saucers for eyes and she's watching this made-for-TV movie called Angel Dusted. And it's about a young group of kids, that had gone off to high school in the United States and, when the ship's in full sail in the prime of their life, so much to come, and they start experimenting with angel dust. And there's this one scene that is still burned in my head of this young girl, 17, I suppose, takes this hit of angel dust and then has this bad trip and runs down the corridor of this 3-story high school, breaks through the glass window, hits the ground, bounces like a super ball, goes down and picks up a piece of glass and starts trying to cut her wrist. Well, needless to say, I'm not on PCP today. This is going to have a profound effect on any young individual that's watching this kind of stuff, right? And the first people to do this were the prohibitionists, right? Get people when they're young and impressionable. And so it's no mistake, therefore, that prohibition takes place, or we vote for it, when many of these individuals come of voting age. So that's part of it. The other half of it, and this needs to be stressed, well, there's two other elements. First of all, those who are perhaps, we know this, are the drinking population are fighting the war overseas. So many of the votes that take place for prohibition are when those drinkers are gone. And then finally, the prohibitionists themselves add another layer to their rhetoric, right? They had often said, prior to the First World War, that if we could just summon the courage to get rid of the liquor traffic, we get rid of all of society's ills, poverty, misery, health defects, crime. All of them would be washed away if we could just banish the body. That's what they would argue. But now when the war hits and there's a culture of self-sacrifice and duty, they say, you know what? Alcohol is the enemy within. It's making our soldiers ineffective overseas, and it's making our wartime workers inefficient on the factory floor. And this resonates with Canadians at a time when they're looking for a long distance way to martyr themselves for the cause. And so beginning in 1916, one province after another goes dry. Ontario, Alberta, Manitoba, 1916. I'm forgetting one, Nova Scotia in 1916. In 1917, BC goes dry, New Brunswick goes dry, and Saskatchewan goes dry, and Newfoundland goes dry. And then in 1918, Quebec goes dry, and the Yukon Territory goes dry. Now, under the terms of the nation-forming BNA Act, the federal government has the power to prohibit the manufacture of intoxicating beverages, while the provincial governments have the power to prohibit its retail sale. And so you can continue to manufacture intoxicating beverages. You just couldn't sell it in those provinces, or at least you couldn't sell it through retail outlets in those provinces where there was dry legislation on the book. And prohibition will last longer in some places than in others. In this province of Ontario, it lasts from 1916 to 1927. In Manitoba, 1916 to 1923. In Nova Scotia, 1916 to 1930. In Quebec, God bless them, they put up with the noble experiment for about 6 months and saying, that's it, we're out. Yeah, comes and goes quite quickly. So it depends on where you are. Okay. So that's the backdrop for John and Hugh Labatt. They're faced with the fact we cannot sell our product legally in this province or any other province across the land where prohibition is in effect. So what do you do? Well, they start making near beer. That's the first thing they do, which is a non-alcoholic or a lower alcoholic beer. It's actually 1.25% alcohol by volume. To put that in perspective, if you have a Budweiser later today, that's going to be 5% ABV. So you would have to drink a bathtub of the stuff to get a buzz. So it's near beer. That's the first thing they do. And there is a lot of people buying this initially until the soldiers start to come home from the front, right? And when they start coming back, they're not pleased with this stuff. They think it's nauseous. They think that it's worse than the atrocities inflicted on them by the Germans. And so they start pouring into the blind pigs across Canada, those illegal drinking establishments that are popping up in Manitoba, in Ontario, elsewhere, right? Where you could get a full strength beer. So near beer saves them in the short term, but then it has an effect. The other thing that they do is that they get involved in a mail word business. And this is something that the Brofmans do, of course. And the guy that's behind this isn't John or Hugh Labatt. It's actually one of the board members, a guy by the name of Hugh Croyne, who comes up with this idea. And what they do is they decide in the early years, that is to say 1916, 1917, and 1918, is they decide what we're going to do is we're going to set up warehouses on the opposite side of the Ottawa River in Gatineau and in Winnipeg. And we're going to produce our beer here in London, ship it out to Winnipeg and the Gatineau. And then we'll wait for the mail orders to come in, and then we'll just ship it to those addresses, right? Because you could import intoxicating beverages into dry provinces. That was a loophole in the law, right? The prohibitions, of course, quickly say foul. This is a shell game, and it is, right? And they go marching down to Ottawa, knock on the door of Borden, who's sympathetic to their cause, and that legal loophole, is quickly pulled shut. And as a result of that, the losses start to mount up, right? Near beers are not selling anymore, and the losses are starting to mount up. So what happens? Well, we get to that date, June 17th, 1921, with the firm on the edge of bankruptcy, and they hand it over to Burke. So what does Burke do? Well, he turns it into the greatest bootlegger in Canadian history. It's debatable. I know the Brofmans are up there too, but this is a close second, if not up there. As number one. So what does Burke do? So he takes over the firm. The first thing he does is go down to the factory floor and says, no more near beer. No one's buying that stuff. Produce full strength beer. And he sells it off the back of trucks into those blind pigs across the province. So that's number one. The second thing he does is he goes down the road to Belleville, to the Colby distillery. And he says to them, I'll buy every bottle that you have. right? And the Colby Distillery, by the way, in 1922 becomes the biggest distillery on the face of the globe. In the midst of Prohibition, we have the biggest distillery. You'd think that this would raise an eyebrow or two, right? Where's all this booze going? Burke seized an opportunity where Hugh and John Labatt couldn't see an opportunity in the Volstead Act. Edmund Burke did, right? This is for various reasons. Hugh and John Labatt didn't want to be perceived as bootleggers. They didn't even want to be in the beer business after the onset of Prohibition. They walked in high society. People frowned at the liquor traffic, and they certainly weren't going to associate with bootleggers. So it wasn't an imagined possibility for them, right? Furthermore, even if they had imagined it, they didn't have the connections in the underworld to make it happen. Burke, on the other hand, right, was cut from a different cloth. He had cut his teeth selling tobacco and whiskey south of the border. He had ties to the darker elements in life. And so he could imagine, and he walked in lower circles. And so he could imagine this. He saw an opportunity in the Volstead Act, which is national prohibition in the United States. So he takes Colby whiskey, he takes it down to the Windsor dock, he buys up a fleet of fishing ships, he decks them over, soups up their engine, and off they go with these forged B13 forms, right, which gets them out of the harbor. And they take their hard liquor to Al Capone in Chicago, the Purple Gang in Detroit, and they sell it everywhere. And for that reason, the Labatt Brewery not only thrives, but survives, but thrives during Prohibition. So that's the transition to a managerial enterprise. And so that's really the first chapter in the history of Labatt Brewery that remains a free agent on the international market until it's bought out in 1995. And that's about all I have to say today.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Bellamy, for a fabulously engaging and interesting guided tour through the wilds of Labatt's early history. I have to say, the irony of having the largest brewery in the world during our experiment with Prohibition is quite comical. I didn't know that. And I've only kind of touched on Prohibition here and there in my own research, just in the course of researching other things, but I found it to be a fabulous talk.